Let's take a look at stem changing verbs. Okay, so we know that when we go to conjugate a verb in the present tense, we have to get the verb's stem. And in this particular case, these verbs will have a change in the stem. The vowel, one of the vowels in the stem will change. And let's take a look and see what this is like. So there's three categories of stem changes. The first category of stem changing verbs, the E of the stem goes to IE. And this is the major category of stem changing verbs. Most of the verbs that undergo a stem change are in the E to IE category, and make sure you familiarize yourself with these verbs. Then there's a smaller category of verbs where the O of the stem changes to UE. And then finally, there's a small category of verbs where the E of the stem can change to I. So let's look at stem changing verbs, okay? Like all verbs in Spanish, stem changer infinitives have one of three of the following endings. They all end in either AR, ER, or IR. We know that. All verbs in Spanish either end in AR, ER, and IR. They're in one of those three categories in their infinitive forms. Okay, and the same for stem changers. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, when we go to conjugate these verbs in the present tense, they're going to have universal endings, never changing endings depending upon the subject pronoun. Okay, so stem changers are going to have the same endings as regular verbs. And I just wanted to, this is just basic review. We learned how to conjugate AR, ER, and IR verbs and put on the endings early in the semester, but here's a quick review of them. And so we see that yo, when the subject pronoun is yo, what do we add to the stem? What is the universal ending we add to the stem? It's an O for all categories. What about to? What if to is a subject pronoun? What is the universal ending we add to the stem? Well, if it's an AR verb, we add an AS. If it's an ER or IR verb, we add an ES. What about the L as well as the AN usted form? What is the universal ending we add onto the stem? In the case of an AR verb, we add an A. And what about ER and IR? We add the letter E. What about the subject pronoun nosotros? What is the universal ending? Well, for AR verbs, it's amos. We add that to the stem. And hemos for ER verbs, and imos for IR verbs. And finally, what about the plural subject pronoun, ellos? What is the ending we add onto the stem for AR verbs? It's an, an. And what about ER and IR verbs? It's en, en. Okay, so what I want you to see here is, and let's go back to the stem now, because when we conjugate a verb, we need to have a stem. We just went through the endings, but what about that stem? Well, how do we get the stem of a verb? Just any regular verb. We drop the AR, ER, or IR ending that we learned, again, to do months ago. Okay, so stem changers will have two stems. Why? Well, they're going to have the stem the original stem that we formed by dropping the AR, ER, or IR. But now we have a second stem, and this is where you must pay attention. We must take the original stem, which we all know how to form, and modify it, and be aware of these modifications. If there is an E in the stem, the original stem, it can change to IE. If there is an O in the original stem, it will change to UE. And for a very small category of verbs, the E of the stem will sometimes change to I. Those are our three categories of stem changing verbs. And we've got to get familiar with these. So let's take a look. Let's look at these three categories of stem changing verbs. Here the E of the stem goes to IE. Here the O of the stem goes to UE, and the E of the stem goes to I. Notice the majority of the verbs that we're going to learn, the majority of the stem changers are verbs where the E goes to IE. And I wrote out the infinitive forms, the 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 infinitive forms of the verb, and then I gave you the two stems because these are stem changers, so they're going to have two stems. So we first start off with the original stem. Let's take a look at the verb cerrar, the verb to close, cerrar. That's the to form, the infinitive. What's the original stem? Ser. We just dropped the AR. Now we've got to find or derive the second stem. Well, we know that it's an E to IE verb, so we change the stem to IE, and we get cier. Cier, and you might want to try pronouncing these. So ser and cier. So that's my second stem. Now, what is the unique thing about stem changing verbs? When we go to conjugate stem changing verbs, and this is very important, it's vital you understand this, you do not use the original stem. You are going to be depending mainly on the second stem when you go to do your conjugations. So let's take a look at the verb cerrar. When we go to conjugate it, we're going to have a stem change in the yo form. So it will be yo cierro. Okay. What about the to form? There'll also be a stem change, always in the to form. So tu cierras, you close. What about the L form or the AF form? Is there a stem change? Yes, there's always a stem change in the L and AF form. So it'll be él cierra, he closes. And what about the nosotros form? This is where you really must pay attention, and this is why stem changing verbs have two stems. We must keep the original stem, ser, for use with nosotros. There is never a stem change in the nosotros form, never. So we go and we use the original stem. So we close is nosotros cerramos, cerramos. There's no stem change. And the same for vosotros. There is no stem change, but we really don't use vosotros in this class. But there would likewise be no stem change with vosotros. Finally, what about the ellos form? Ellos, ustedes form. There is always a stem change. So it would be ellos cierran. So again, this is vitally important. With stem changing verbs, they have two stems, the original stem by dropping the AR, ER, IR, and the second stem by changing the E to IE, the O to UE, or the E to I. The second stem is the most important stem when you're conjugating. It will always be used with the yo form, with the tu form, with the el, ella, usted forms, and with the plural ellos forms. Those will always have the stem change. The only time we do not use the stem change is with nosotros and vosotros. There is no stem change. You use the original stem. Okay, so let's take again a quick look at some of these verbs. I did cerrar, where the E goes to IE. Let's look at another one. Here's entender, an important verb, to understand. Now notice entender has, we get the first stem is entend. You just drop the ER. But notice how we derive the stem changed stem. Entender has two E's. Well, which, with some of our verbs, they're going to have two E's. Which E do you change? It's always the E closest to the end of the verb, okay? So we're going to change this E, the end E, so it'll be entiende is my second stem. Okay, let's look at some O to UE verbs. Here's an important verb, dormir, to sleep. The first stem is dorm. Okay, we just dropped the IR in. But the most important stem, and the one we're going to be using mostly in our conjugations, the O goes to UE, so it becomes duerm. It's pronounced like where? Duerm. Okay. And so if I went to conjugate the verb dormir, I'm going to have a stem change with yo, so it's yo duermo. I'm going to have a stem change with tú duermes. I'm going to have a stem change with él duerme. With ella duerme. Usted, yes, I'll have a stem change. Usted duerme. What about nosotros? Never have a stem change with nosotros, so it will be nosotros dormimos. That's why we keep that original stem. And then what about ellos? The plural form, we will have a stem change, so ellos duermen. They sleep. And finally, let's look at this last category of stem changers, E to IE, where the E of the original stem goes to I. Pedir is the verb to request, ask for. It has the word petition in it, to request, ask for. So the first stem is ped. The second stem now will have a stem change, ped. So let's go ahead and conjugate it. So yo pido. There's a stem change because we always have a stem change with yo. What about tú? Tú pides. There's a stem change. What about él? Él pide. He asks for. There's always a stem change. What about nosotros? No stem change. Nosotros pedimos. And finally, what about the ellos form? Yes, there always is a stem change. Ellos piden. With that in mind, let's do some practice exercises. So let's look at the first exercise here. So we have yo cerrar. Will there be a stem change? Yes, of course. There's always a stem change with yo. What is the ending that goes with yo? It's O, right? Those are universal. We learned those way back at the beginning of this semester. So let's go ahead and conjugate this. It'll be yo cierro. What about nosotros? We have cerrar again. We want to say we close. Will there be a stem change? No, there's never a stem change with nosotros nor vosotros. So we'll use the original stem. Nosotros cerramos. What about empezar? Okay, with ella, she begins. Empezar means to begin. I want to conjugate that. Will there be a stem change? Yes, there's always a stem change with ella. Okay, and which E will it be? Well, because there's going to be two E's in the stem. The second E, always the E closest to the end. So ella empieza. Ella empieza. What about nosotros? We begin. Will there be a stem change? No, there's never a stem change with nosotros. So it's going to be nosotros empezamos. Let's take a look at the verb preferir. It has two E's in the stem. Okay, but let's go back and look at it. Will there be a stem change with yo? I want to say I prefer. Yes, there always is a stem change with yo. So now where will it be? It'll be in the second E. So yo prefiero. What about nosotros? We prefer. Will there be a stem change? No, there never is a stem change. So it'll be nosotros preferimos. All right, let's do some ODUE verbs. Almorzar is the verb to have lunch. I want to say I have lunch. Will there be a stem change? Of course there will. There always is with yo. So yo almuerzo. What about nosotros? No, there never is a stem change. So it will be almorzamos, no stem change. What about the verb poder? A very important verb. In Spanish, it means to be able to. It's the verb to be able to, can in English. Now, if I want to say you can, will there be a stem change? Of course there will be. There's always a stem change with tú, so tú puedes. What about nosotros? We can. No, there's never stem change. No, nosotros podemos. And what about yo? If I want to say I can, is there a stem change? Yes, of course. There's always a stem change with yo. Yo puedo. I can. Now, let's look at number 6. It's asking a question. The subject is quién, who. Well, what's the subject pronoun there? It's the ella pronoun, so we want the ella form of dormir. Is there a stem change with the ella conjugation? Of course, there always is a stem change with and ella, with the third person singular. So it will be quien duerme. The O goes to you. E. Okay, and finally, what about nosotros? There's never a stem change, so nosotros dormimos. We sleep. Quien duerme? Who sleeps? And then let's look at our last category of verbs. This is where the E goes to IE, and so we have the verb pedir, to ask for, request, order. It's got the verb that looks like the verb petition in English. So we want to say they ask for, they order. Is there a stem change? Of course, there's always a stem change in the ellos form. Ellos piden. What about nosotros? Is there going to be a stem change if we want to say we ask for, we request? No, there never is with nosotros. It's pedimos. What about the verb servir? Okay, it's an ira I stem change. Will it be a stem change? Of course, there always is with yo sirvo. What about ella? Yes, there's always a stem change with ella. Ella sirve. What about nosotros? We serve. Never a stem change. Servimos. And finally, let's take a look at the verb decir. It's a little bit, it's doubly irregular. It's an irregular yo verb. We've learned it earlier as an irregular yo verb, but it just has an irregular form. But of course, there will be a stem change. There always is a stem change with stem changers in the yo form. It's just a little weird. It's yo digo, I say, or I tell. What about the ellos form of decir? Will there be a stem change? Of course. And the E will go to I. So it's ellos dicen, they say. What about nosotros? And it should have an S on the end there. What about nosotros? Is there a stem change with nosotros? Never. So we're gonna keep the original stem. Nosotros decimos, we say. So that does it with stem changing verbs.